Okay, we are still waiting on a few folks, but I am gonna kind of get this agenda moving. So first and foremost, thank you all for joining us this evening. We are obviously waiting for a few more folks to trickle in, but I imagine the attendance will continue to rise over the next couple of minutes. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. A couple of quick housekeeping items just for folks' background information. This is a Zoom webinar this evening, and we are obviously recording it for future use. And so you will be able to, we will share this with everyone that has registered after the event, and make sure that folks have access to this recording and this event to share with their friends and family and networks. I also wanted to briefly thank our sponsors and co-hosts this evening. Obviously, we're going to hear from some of them, especially including the Coalition for Smarter Growth, the West Baltimore Project, the Maryland Sierra Club, as well as the Celebrate the Greenbelt Forest Preserve. So thanks to everybody who has helped pull this event together, and obviously big thanks to the delegate for being here this evening. A couple of other just sort of small things. I wanted to briefly thank a handful of local elected officials who have joined us this evening and who have kind of been leading this fight. I wanted to briefly thank particularly Jay Davis and Emmett Jordan, who registered for this event and have been leading the fight in Greenbelt at the Greenbelt City Council. We saw that Lori Ann Sales with the Council of Gaithersburg has joined us. The mayor of Bladensburg, Takesha James, has registered this evening. And if there are others that have registered and I have somehow missed you, I really do apologize. You can send me a message in the Q&A box and we can give you some recognition. But thank you to all of our local elected officials who have joined us this evening and who are leading the charge on this. Before we get started into our broader agenda, I wanted to present everybody with a quick round of poll questions to see where everybody is calling in from this evening, how you heard about this event, and your stance generally on the Maglev. So take 1 or 2 minutes to fill out this poll, and we'll reconvene in a moment. Thanks. All right, I'm gonna wrap that up. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you taking that moment to quickly share that. We are going to move right on into our agenda. And first and foremost, I am going to briefly kind of set the stage for folks. As you all know, we're gathered here this evening to discuss alternatives to the proposed Baltimore-Washington Maglev project. I wanted to take a few moments ahead of that to set the stage. What is Maglev, and why are those of us who are on the panel this evening opposed to this project? So first and foremost, just as a general background, Maglev stands for magnetic levitation, which essentially is an electronic or an electric train system that uses magnets to float the train. This is a new concept, a brand new concept to the United States. There is a test track that is operational in Japan. They were building one of these in Germany. There was a deadly crash in 2006, and the project was canceled a few years later due to cost overruns. The current proposal is Baltimore to Washington. However, project developer Northeast Maglev has expressed many times that they eventually want to run this New York City, Boston, and beyond. Current project cost is upwards of $15 billion, and the average ticket cost is about $60 one way, depending on when you purchase and that sort of stuff. But the DEIS identified that as the average ticket cost. The train can theoretically travel up to 300 miles an hour, and project developers claim that you would get from Baltimore to Washington in 15 minutes. Of course, that is on the caveat that that is the Cherry Hill station in Baltimore, so not really all the way into Baltimore. And of course, where it includes in Washington, it's not interconnected to any other transit systems. You would then have to convert to either taxi or Uber, or walk to a metro station or walk to a bus station. The project planning began, at least on this portion of the project. This has been kind of in planning for quite some time, but this most recent project planning began in 2016. Some information was released to the public in spring of 2017. The Federal Railroad Administration opened a draft environmental impact statement in January 15th, and it closed May 24th. That public comment period closed May 24th. Early May 6, 2021 of this year, the project developer went before Congress and testified before a House subcommittee on railroads that they would like $300 million from Congress to help fund this project. The project was paused, however, by the Federal Railroad Administration a couple weeks ago, August 25th, and next steps and timing are very, very uncertain at this point in the game. This is a very quick map of what this project would look like. The project sponsor's preferred alternative is in this map, with a map at Cherry Hill in a Mount Vernon Square East Station in Washington, D.C., with an above ground portion of the project for about the middle 1/3, crossing Fort Meade, the Patuxent Research Reserve, National Park Service property at the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, as well as potentially the Greenbelt Forest Preserve, where the train would then kind of go back underground as it heads into Washington, D.C. This includes about 40 miles of construction in total. And the alternative, the project sponsor's preferred alternative, J-03, would have the greatest total impacts on federal lands at Patuxent, at National Park Service, and at USDA property at Park. A couple of just quick notes on Maglev infrastructure. This is an entirely new system, and so therefore they would have to build entirely new train stations, entirely new tunnels. This is not connected to Amtrak or MARC in any way. It's an entirely new setup. They would need a train maintenance facility, about a 200-acre industrial site, which they are proposing they put on the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, BARC facility. They would need fresh air emergency egress facilities, which are approximately 4 to 5 acres every 3.5 miles along the tunnel section. Power facilities, maintenance facilities. The right-of-way would be 72 feet wide with fences to keep people out. This is not like a small system. This is a big system. And a couple of environmental impacts of the project. This is what it would look like above ground at Baltimore-Washington Parkway. You can see that it would tower above the trees 150 feet off the ground. We're looking at about 140 acres of park, 450 acres of forest, 76 acres of floodplain, almost 1,300 linear feet of waterways, 19 acres of wetlands, all in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, upwards of 328 acres of federal property impacted, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA, NASA, Secret Service, Fort Meade. Despite claims from the project developer, the DEIS would actually increase net transportation energy consumption by about 3.0 trillion BTUs. This is a 39% increase in transit transportation energy consumption. It is more efficient than auto travel, but significantly less efficient than existing bus and passenger rail, respectively, which is obviously what we're here to discuss tonight. A couple of community impacts. Minority and low income populations would really get the brunt of this construction impacts and long-term impacts. 70% of the total population affected area are minority populations, and 13% of the project affected environment are low income. We're looking at like long-term concerns such as the permanent location of air vents, the permanent location of the above ground portion, as well as short-term, 5 to 10 year of construction, hauling, dirt storage, laydown, dust, noise, that sort of stuff. The above ground feature would be negatively impact on communities and conserved resources, with trains whizzing by communities 24 hours a day. They do not stop running. And there are, of course, lots of unknowns, impacts to aquifers, toxic landfills, vibration impacts on nearby homes and neighborhoods, and that sort of stuff. And I believe that concludes this little presentation I had, and we are now going to roll into our presenters. And so, that is Maglev. That is the environmental community impacts are of some of the many reasons to be opposed to this project. There are obviously a lot of reasons, but NVCA and our partners here tonight don't want to just be opposed to this project. We want to bring real solutions to the problems in the region, which is why we have this panel together this evening. We recognize that solving the region's congestion problems, the climate crisis, and other regional issues don't have one silver bullet. This is going to take a lot of different solutions, a lot of really good ideas, all brought together to collectively work to solve this problem. So tonight, our panel includes Delegate Jared Solomon, who represents Maryland's House District 18 in Montgomery. He serves on the House Appropriations Committee and is a member of the Transit Caucus. He has been a champion of transit initiatives in the Maryland House of Delegates. Jonathan Sachs with the Baltimore Washington Transportation Research Group's West Baltimore Project, leading the charge to bring MARC Express service and economic revitalization to West Baltimore. And Stuart Schwartz, Executive Director for Coalition for Smarter Growth. The Coalition for Smarter Growth promotes walkable, inclusive, and transit-oriented communities in the Washington, D.C. region, and the land use and transportation policies and investments needed to make those communities flourish. We were, of course, supposed to be joined this evening by Delegate Robin Lewis, who unfortunately had something pop up at the last minute and sent her condolences to this group, and unfortunately she was unable to join us. But we are going to power forward with the three awesome panels that we have. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Delegate Solomon to give some remarks. So thank you, Delegate.
Thank you, Kyle. It's a real pleasure to be here. I spent a lot of time on Zooms with Stuart and Jane from the Coalition for Smarter Growth, so it's nice to be here with you all again. And Jonathan, thank you for your work in Baltimore. As Kyle mentioned, I have the distinct honor of representing District 18 in the House of Delegates, Montgomery County, kind of the Connecticut Avenue corridor, the communities of Wheaton, Kensington, Chevy Chase, and Silver Spring. And we are really lucky, frankly, to have a lot of great transit. We have a number of MARC stations that run through the heart of our district with the Brunswick line. We're sort of bookended on either side by Red Line stations. And someday soon, we hope to have actual Purple Line stations that are up and running, connecting us to College Park if we ever get the project finished. And one of my top priorities really coming into the legislature was making sure, frankly, that the MARC rail system was the kind of commuter rail system that we all could be proud of, that would make us, a competitive region with really the best systems in the world. I grew up, tell people the other Montgomery County outside of Philadelphia, and the SEPTA rail system, frankly, was really my bread and butter as a teenager and as a college student when I came home. It allowed me to get really all over the place. It presented so many opportunities to me. My parents live about 3 blocks from the Narberth R5 station, the Thorndale Paoli line, if any of you are familiar with it. And that's a regional rail system that is not just designed for commuters. It's designed to move people around the region. It connects, frankly, with New Jersey and with Delaware, and you can take it. Maybe a little bit long, but you could take it, multiple rides to destinations in almost any part of the tri-state area. And we have, an opportunity really with our MARC system to do the same thing. And in the context of what we're talking about here today, when you look at the communities that Maglev would potentially run through, would frankly leave behind, it would cannibalize, most importantly, what could be an incredible, and what will be, after we make the proper investments, an incredible asset in the MARC system that is not only, when we're finished, able to, in many ways, convey people, as Kyle was saying, in almost the same time, with the completion of the now Frederick Douglass Tunnel, which I'll touch on in a second, you could potentially get from Baltimore to the heart of Washington Union Station in under a half an hour, and a train that will also serve all of the communities along the way between Baltimore and DC, and will actually connect the region as opposed to leaving out broad swaths of communities, and not to mention the really detrimental environmental impact that I know Kyle mentioned as well. And so, again, really, since coming into the legislature, I started my career in Baltimore City as a teacher, and I've always loved this region. We decided to make Montgomery County our home, but it's really always kind of bugged me how separate the DC and the Baltimore region really are in many ways. And if we had a rail system, if we fully embraced MARC and connected the region, I think it would break down so many barriers. It would create so many economic opportunities, so many connections that don't exist today. And so, again, it's been one of my top priorities. And so I'm really lucky to be part of a vision group, an advisory group that Stuart and I actually sit on together, with the Greater Washington Partnership, which is really, very smartly brought together elected leaders. And actually, one of your champions, Councilmember Glaros from Prince George's County, also serves on it. It has brought together elected leaders. It's brought together civic leaders, business leaders, regional planners, transportation policy experts, to really sit down and say, what do we need to get to a place where we have essentially all day, in some instances, 15-minute headways in both directions on MARC Rail. And we're connecting not only Maryland to Virginia and the District of Columbia, but we're connecting Maryland with Delaware as well. And how do we go about not just putting the plan in place, but how do we actually build the political will to make it a reality? We've talked about this for a long time, but we haven't actually seen progress. And I think, honestly, in the last year, we have made actual demonstrable progress, and I hope that I think there will be more to come shortly, in a way that I don't think we've done in a very long time. And when we look a little bit to our south, we see essentially, Virginia is taking our lunch, right? We often hear in the DC region that Virginia is beating the pants off of us, right? And in the instance of rail, they really are. The advantage that we have is our infrastructure is better. They have a lot further to go to catch up, but we are seeing, billions of dollars of investments. And, in 2019, Virginia came together with Amtrak, with the business community, to make a $4 billion investment in their passenger rail and VRE, upgrading the Long Bridge, in putting in place new rail lines just really across the state. And, it's frustrating because we have the potential to do that here in Maryland. We just haven't had the political will. And so this group that was brought together by the Greater Washington Partnership, I think really has the potential to do that. And working collectively with the GWP and, many of the partners, who are part of the advisory group, we put a piece of legislation forward, the MARC Service Expansion Act, in 2020. It was the last bill passed in the shortened COVID session that began the process of essentially starting run-through service on the Penn Line. It started run-through service into Delaware to close the rail gap that we have between, it's the only gap in commuter rail on the Northeast Corridor between Perryville and Elkton all the way up to Newark, Delaware. And it began the process of trying to figure out the best way to connect the Camden and the Penn lines in Baltimore. And we, unfortunately, Governor Hogan vetoed that. And in May of 2020, we came back the beginning of this year and we overrode it. And to MTA's credit, they have been, fully embracing it and doing the work. And we're hoping that we'll get some good news out of them shortly about the connection to Virginia. But that Long Bridge project will unlock really a seamless, imagine a one-trip ride from hopefully anywhere in Maryland into Northern Virginia and vice versa. Talk about the number of cars that'll get off the road, the connections for economic development with the ecosystem of Amazon that's growing and quantum computing in College Park, and the biotech corridor in Montgomery County up through Frederick. The Delaware connection will really introduce what has been, essentially a Philadelphia regional university at the University of Delaware, to the DC corridor, to the DC Baltimore corridor, and allow, essentially a whole, new crop of thousands of college students and other leading research university that can bring their resources and their students into the DC Baltimore region. The other thing I mentioned is the BNP tunnel, as many of you know it as, but it will now be the Frederick Douglass tunnel. The state worked collaboratively with Amtrak and with our business community to really unlock what will be a tremendous potential, and I know Jonathan will talk about that. And so, again, in the context of why we're all here tonight, what I would implore you is we have an opportunity. We're working on legislation for next session, and we're working on essentially putting that vision into action of, how we can make the investments in the MARC system, instead of pie in the sky ideas, that will destroy communities, really investing in communities to allow us all to benefit from a system that we already have. We don't need a shiny new object when we just need to put a little polish on what we've got already. We're hoping that there's going to be some really exciting announcements on the Brunswick line, that I know will really benefit my constituents and will help with the economic development and the growth that we've got in Frederick County and points west. And so I feel like I'm talking a lot. There's more that I could say, but again, Kyle, I appreciate the invitation to be here and really excited to take questions and excited for the work of all of us and this community to propel MARC into really the 21st century.
Absolutely. Thank you, Delegate. Next, I want to invite Jonathan Sachs with the West Baltimore Project to say a few words about what they're working on and the vision that they have for the Baltimore-Washington region.
Oh, thanks, Kyle. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all the panelists, and thanks for everybody for organizing this. It's a really important subject, so it's great to be a part of it. I'm Jonathan Sachs. I'm the Baltimore-Washington Transportation Research Group's West Baltimore Project lead. The project is an initiative that was started by myself to investigate the question of whether there could be a transportation component that we're missing in the ongoing challenge of economic revitalization in the 3 neighborhood clusters around the West Baltimore MARC station, which is arguably the most disinvested area of the state. It's a place that's near and dear to my heart, having grown up in West Baltimore. And frankly, it's been painful to listen to the tales of economic woe from the area, while the rest of the Washington-Baltimore metropolitan statistical area, which stretches all the way to the Pennsylvania line and across the bridge into Queen Anne County, has been going gangbusters for decades with periods of double-digit growth after double-digit growth. So we're a transportation research group. We pose the question, as I mentioned, could transportation be that missing key? And no surprise here, the answer was a resounding yes. And the one item that kept popping up in the data as perhaps the most critical potential economic driver of revitalization in that part of West Baltimore was, of course, express MARC service to and from Washington. So we transitioned the project from research to lobbying and began pushing for that a couple of years ago. And today I'm happy to report, I think we've had a little progress. Shout out to MTA Administrator Arnold for having vision and taking chances. A couple of weeks ago, I had the tremendous pleasure of riding on MARC's first ever true peak hour express train between Washington and Baltimore. Train 536 left Union Station at 5:13 p.m. and arrived at BWI in 23 minutes, which is faster than Acela. The train then continued on to West Baltimore, where it arrived at exactly 30 minutes, but didn't stop, which is a sore point for us, as you can imagine, but one we're hopeful will be addressed in short order. And then it continued on to Baltimore Penn Station, where it arrived at 40 minutes on the button, 35% faster than the normal 1-hour service. In many ways, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Those commute times, when the service is fully ramped up, will be transformational to those areas. As points of comparison, Bethesda is 23 minutes from Union Station via DC Metro. And by the way, that's the fastest way to get to Union Station from Bethesda, more so than driving. Northern Virginia's booming Arlington corridor is 25 to 40 minutes, depending on which station you board, to Union Station via DC Metro. So these potential Baltimore and Northern Anne Arundel County commute times to and from DC will well and truly, and finally, weave these areas seamlessly into the downtown DC economy. Now, the ramifications for that are huge, and I will tell you, just as an aside, that we quickly understood one key ramification, the impact on affordable housing. And we immediately set to work studying the problem and ultimately came up with a highly workable plan for the preservation in perpetuity of as much as 50% of the existing residents in these areas of West Baltimore, regardless of the amount of revitalization that happens in the future. Those percentages, were we to hit them, would be 5 times the typical numbers in downtown DC, where remaining pre-revitalization residents is often below 10%. And we're lobbying elected leaders now to get that plan in place too. But again, we're here to talk about transportation. So I'll just say simply, a true full schedule Mark Express service is not just one of the key missing components of economic revitalization in some of the most disinvested areas of West Baltimore. It's perhaps, as Delegate Solomon said, the most underutilized economic driver in the entire state of Maryland. All elected leaders and transportation leaders want to talk about is transportation catalyzed economic growth and also equity. Yet here we've got one of the areas of Maryland, West Baltimore, in particular around that train station, most prime for economic growth from transportation upgrades because of that tremendous proximity to Washington. And it's 97% African American and 35% below the poverty line. And yet we haven't leaned into its full potential with Mark Express. Instead, we're talking about a 10+ billion taxpayer dollar boondoggle that's also, with $60 tickets and unfilled trains, going to be a giant vacuum of transportation dollars into the foreseeable future. Of course, I'm talking about Maglev, all for a trip that's going to run, as we've started to discuss already, not from the transportation hub of the entire area, Union Station, but instead from Mount Vernon Square, where DC's head of planning says the train will, quote, change the urban environment and have substantial construction and long-term operational implications. It's going to travel 15 minutes to Cherry Hill, if Maglev can get the land, where riders will then need to leave the Maglev train and catch a light rail train over the water to the stadiums or the Howard Street area, where presumably folks will then need to walk or drive an additional 4 to 8 blocks more to the harbor or the business district, to which you have to assume many of them will be going with $60 tickets. To lots of audiences, the Maglev folks want to talk about this train being a vehicle for quick travel from DC to New York, sort of a wink and a nod thing, but that's not how it's being sold in the federal documents. In the federal draft environmental impact statement, the first 2 objectives listed of the Maglev service make it clear that this is supposed to be a local commuting vehicle, and that's why the fund should be allocated. To quote, the first objective is to improve redundancy and mobility options for transportation between the metropolitan areas of Baltimore and Washington, DC. The second objective, provide connectivity to existing transportation modes in the region. So from the federal document standpoint, what we're talking about here is a direct competitor to Mark Express at 6 times the price of a ticket, and that doesn't go where you need it to go, West Baltimore and Baltimore Penn Station, where the true large-scale economic opportunities exist. Now, some folks will say, why can't we do both? And the answer is the age-old one. We don't have enough money. Look no farther than the recent BMP tunnel announcement to see how constrained transportation dollars truly are. In June, Governor Hogan announced an agreement with the federal government to name the new replacement tunnel under Baltimore after Frederick Douglass. But lost to many in that announcement was that the new tunnel project for the Penn Line was miraculously being scaled down by 50% from 4 planned individual tracks to 2, all to save just 20% of the costs or $1 billion out of the $5 billion. So here's probably Amtrak's third highest priority project on its highest priority route, the Northeast Corridor, the only route that makes money for it, by the way. And we're cutting this historic once in a century project in half to save $1 billion. At the same time, we're talking about spending $10 billion of taxpayer dollars on a train for the rich that is immediately going to create a giant suck of more of those already constrained dollars now and into the future. To us, as a transportation research organization, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Finally, it's worth noting that in the same tunnel announcement, Maryland Transportation Secretary Slater kept talking about how this tunnel, when completed 12 to 15 years from now, will finally facilitate 30-minute train service between Baltimore and Washington. So it's super ironic to us that just a couple of months later, Mark was hitting those same times with existing trains on existing tracks, and frankly has the capacity to do a lot more. It's clear there's some disconnects in the local and federal transportation world between what's reportedly possible in the future and what's actually happening now, between what's said about equity and what's actually done, and between what's needed for commuting in the area and what's actually being planned. Maglev is not the commuting vehicle that's needed. Mark Express is. And from West Baltimore's standpoint, it's time we get serious about it. Thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions and to hearing more.
Thanks, Jonathan. And then next up on our panel this evening is Stuart Schwartz with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. Thanks, Stuart.
Hold on, folks. I'm going to share my screen and just do a few slides. Hold on. Now, it's hard to top Jonathan and Delegate Solomon there, and I'm not even going to try to. I'm going to try to just fill in some other areas with a little bit of a DC regional perspective to this. You've heard that really this is about choices and priorities, and that's where I'll focus. But starting from what our vision is, what are our real needs, what's our market, and the Coalition for Smarter Growth has been around for nearly 25 years now. Next year's our 25th anniversary. Jane Lyons is on the Zoom with us today. She's our Maryland Advocacy Manager. She leads in Montgomery and on our statewide transportation policy. She's complemented by Cheryl Court, our Policy Director, who works in Prince George's. And for most of this time, we've had a singular vision of a network of livable communities, a network of transit-oriented communities that was adopted by the Council of Governments in their Region Forward Plan and vision. And we have the advantage of, the 100+ metro stations, the Purple Line coming, as well as the commuter rail lines that you've heard about, Mark, and in Virginia, VRE, as places where we can create walkable transit-oriented communities. So it's a vision of revitalized cities, Baltimore and Washington and Richmond. It's a vision of a place where you can live without a car or car light because you have everything nearby in a walkable community. And it has transformed our landscape. And it's because it's a high frequency service with high capacity that's not focused on the long distance like the Maglev is proposing to do. And this is the transformation, which is just a way to really show how dramatically metro system, high capacity, high frequency transit can transform a place, building up in the nodes around transit. But it's a model that is coming to Prince George's. In the lower right is Largo, still very auto dependent, but we've managed to get the regional medical center there, and they're working on plans for a much more walkable community there. You see the groundbreaking for the Purple Line. Oh, those were briefly happy days. By the way, that was cost cut as well, unnecessarily, and under the same governor. And I think we're going to regret some of the cuts that were made to some of the important connections within the Purple Line system. But still, it's a great tool for revitalization inside the Beltway and for connecting people to jobs. one thing really important to note, and you've heard it a little bit, is about the impact on equity from the Maglev and where our needs really are. This is the Council of Governments Equity Emphasis Areas. It shows our east-west economic divide. You can see that many of these are in the path of the Maglev and would be affected by its construction and operation. But these are also the places we need to provide better access to jobs, not $60 tickets. What we need to do is provide places where we can bring investment to them. Here's an illustration of how you could transform some of the locations along the purple line with development. And we can do it, and we must do it with affordable housing. This one happens to be in DC, but affordable housing near jobs and transit is one of our best transportation solutions and is best linked up to things like our metro system, our MARC system, and our bus systems. It's all about creating places where you can do 15-minute living. Remember, your commutes are only about 20% of all of our trips. And that's what many of the long distance trains are about, or the longer distance trains can be about. But really, it's about the other 80% of trips that are non-work trips, where we're trying to reduce travel by car, where we're going to use transit, but we're also going to walk and bike. And we have huge needs in our region. You've heard about MARC, there's VRE, there's Metro Rail, but there's also the transformation of our bus networks. And we were part of the bus transformation project. This illustrates the local bus networks. Jane and I and others are working really hard on redesigning these networks to be more frequent, provide better access to job for our essential workforce. This is a high priority for spending. In addition, what I'll add to the MARC story is what the Greater Washington Partnership has done, and Delegate Solomon has alluded to it. We've been on the stakeholder committees for this. The simple solution that makes a lot of sense of MARC and VRE running through to the opposite state and being able to give someone a one vehicle, one trip ride to a job in the other state, from a home to a job across the boundaries. This too, much more needed investment, much higher priority than the Maglev. And others can probably talk about it in great detail, but let's not forget that we do have a significant Amtrak Northeast Corridor investment plan and many needs. Virginia is getting way ahead of Maryland and some of the other states. I want Maryland to catch up to Virginia. And they are making major investments in their corridors from the Shenandoah Valley and Roanoke to DC, and from Norfolk, Hampton Roads to DC, obviously connecting into the rest of the Northeast Corridor as well. And really, in the end, it's about the future we want for our kids. We want a future with frequent transit, providing a range of transit opportunities: Amtrak, MARC, Metro, bus, bike, and walking in these livable communities. I'm going to show our contact information here, but then I'm going to take it off, and I'll conclude with a couple of thoughts. Back in the UK, over a decade ago, there was the Eddington study. And the UK had high frequency train envy of France and Spain and Germany and Japan, et cetera. And they looked at the economics of it and looked at the needs, and they concluded that the needs were for that large metroplex that is London, to get their people to work on better commuter rail, better tube service, better bus service, and that the economic return was going to be much higher. And so the same goes here, that we need to look at this objectively. We are transit agnostics at CSG. Let's make it work with the land use. Let's make it meet the market you're trying to serve. Let's meet the needs of the vast majority of people. Let's study it objectively with a range of alternatives and needs on the table, and not do a single focused study driven by one industry or one sector. And that's what we're hoping for going forward, that we will look at our greatest needs, those will serve the most people, and make that wide range of investments rather than put all our eggs in this shiny new basket. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. At this time, we're going to kind of roll to a question and answer portion. So if you have questions for our panelists, our awesome panelists, please enter them into the Q&A box, and I will filter through those as they come in. I have a couple already to kind of get the conversation going, but please funnel those questions into the chat. So first, right out of the gate, the proposed Baltimore-Washington project, Maglev project, could cost upwards of $16 billion. And they've requested at least $300 million in federal funding, with likely more being needed down the road. They recently advocated against a bill in the Maryland General Assembly, which would have blocked state money from going to the project. So obviously they have their eye on taxpayer dollars to help make this project happen. How could Maglev impact other transit priorities if it were to receive state and federal funding?
I mean, Kyle, I can jump in, although I know Stuart and Jonathan probably know even better than I. But you know, I think it was Jonathan that mentioned our dollars are not limitless. You know, just think about what $300 million could do to, you know, help transit-oriented development at stations like Odenton or you know, or West Baltimore, as Jonathan has talked about. You know, that could buy new train sets and locomotives for the MARC system so that we could do you know, headways and run trains more frequently. We could run more of those express services. It could buy sidings so that there's places for, you know, trains to step aside when CSX comes through in the Brunswick line, or, you know, when Amtrak trains come through on the Penn or the Camden line. I mean, there are limitless possibilities. I mean, God, we could, I mean, MARC fare is, you know, obviously, it's not even comparable to what the fare of a Maglev would be, but we could use that to lower fares, you know, for low-income residents who need to rely on it. So again, there are a whole host of things in a universe of limited dollars and limited resources that we could use that for, frankly, starting tomorrow, to improve MARC rail.
So Kyle, I'll just jump in here as well, and I'll say, so Stuart talked about cuts that were made to the Purple Line. You know, I talked about cuts that were made to the BMP tunnel, which in the scope of Maglev would be almost peanuts. I mean, we can also look at things like the Red Line in Baltimore City that was cut for, you know, savings of whatever it was, a few $100 million. It cost us $900 million plus in federal money. I mean, there's project after project, but really the numbers are so enormous for Maglev that the amount it would potentially constrain transportation dollars if transportation dollars are all considered in one bucket, as they normally are at the federal and state level. I mean, the numbers are so huge, it's almost difficult to talk about it in a sensible way. When you talk about 16 billion or 10 billion just for 10 billion in taxpayer dollars just for a leg that goes from Baltimore to Washington. I mean, how much are the other legs going to cost, and where's that money going to come from? I mean, we can't even find. So I'll give you an example. At the BWI rail station, we've had a project that's been approved that has that has an environmental impact statement that was approved, I believe, back in 2017, or maybe even farther back, 2015, 2014. We've had that thing. That project has been in Amtrak's top 12 priority list for longer than a decade, probably upwards of 2 decades. Its price tag right now is $500 million. And just doing that will allow you to get that third rail of MARC in use, that third track of MARC in use at the BWI rail station. And that alone could increase capacity on the Penn line upwards of 30%. So that's $500 million. There are a number of engineers who've identified ways to do that for half that price, $250 million. But in our conversations with elected leaders, it's not even a possibility. It's not even something they're going to talk about. Those numbers are so huge to them. So that's $250 million. And with Maglev, you're talking about 16 billion just for the leg from Baltimore to Washington. It's a difference by an order.
It is astounding, and just, you know, the number of things that are more affordable though that we can buy for MARC and in buses, you know, and certainly not forget the operating dollars. We spend a lot on capital in America, but have been reluctant to spend on the operating dollars, which would give us more drivers and more buses and more vehicles and more frequency that would help people in more ways. And you mentioned TOD, transit-oriented development. You know, for the east side of the DC region, it would really help to have state and federal dollars invested in the other things that we need for transit-oriented communities, like just the grid of streets you need for that, rather than have the private developer have to pay for all of the infrastructure. That would really spark and incentivize those things to happen. There are some big ticket items out there too that would compete for certainly in big numbers to some extent. Union Station, which is the most important spot in DC. It has more trips every year than any of the airports in the region, but most people don't know that. And it's very accessible from the Maryland suburbs and by MARC and VRE, as well as Amtrak and Metro. And that's $7 billion to do the major upgrades it needs to all of its tracks, all of its rail yards, and to be able to build over the station and expand the concourse. Recently, Metro was looking at its core capacity problems at Metro Center, Gallery Place, Farragut North, and especially the Roslyn Tunnel. The Roslyn Tunnel alone, if it stood alone, would be potentially a $10 billion project. But when it's combined with what would be more effective, some Blue Line connections into Maryland, we're talking up to 20 to 25 billion. Hopefully that could be lower, but it still serve far more people and sort of create far more economic development than the Maglev alternative. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. We are going to roll into some questions that have come in the chat. There are 3 that are all pertaining to sort of different lines in, kind of in tandem. So, and I'll let panelists kind of take this as a sum of the whole or in part if you'd like. There's a question about the plan to connect Penn and Camden lines, what the plan is to connect the Penn and Camden MARC lines. There's another question about the Purple Line and what the path forward there is and when that is going to start up again. And then there's one other question in regards to the canceled Red Line and ways to connect that into MARC service and improve MARC service in Baltimore. So like I said, you get to answer that in part. That's obviously kind of 3 different questions, but all about interconnectivity and different lines and that sort of stuff.
So I'll just start by taking that Red Line question really quickly because I can answer it really quickly. This station here behind me is where the Red Line was supposed to connect into. This was supposed to be a multimodal station. This is the Penn Line. This is the heart of the Penn Line. This is the closest area on the Penn Line of Baltimore to Washington, D.C. The Red Line was supposed to run right down Franklin Street here, was supposed to stop here just down the stairs with a new multimodal modern station where you walk off the MARC and you take the escalator down and you jump on the Red Line and you're like 3 minutes behind me to downtown Baltimore. And you're also, by the way, heading out to the suburbs this way, the other way. So this is where it would happen. This is how it would happen. This is where the Red Line is planned to go. The station would be part of this MARC station. So I'll leave the other questions for the other panelists.
On the Purple Line, the latest news is depressing. I mean, on the one hand, they're going to get started again. They hope to have a contract signed with a new contractor by February, but the reports are it could take several months for a new contractor to get started up. So it's been tragic to see this disaster and how much time we have lost on the Purple Line, all because of really squirrely Public-Private Transportation Act deal that was signed. Again, let's focus on fixing our existing systems first and completing our existing projects first. Let's get the Purple Line back on track.
Yeah, to piggyback off of Stuart's comment, I mean, honestly, there is some progress being made on the Purple Line, very minimal. They're continuing to, to do some of the utility movement, but about a quarter of a mile, half a mile from where I live, there's a big open pit where the Purple Line should really be. And we've had, the Capitol Crescent Trail closed now for almost 4 years. Just about a couple of weeks ago was the 4-year anniversary of the closure, which I know has been a real sore point for so many folks in our community. So yeah, we're hopeful that will come. I guess on the plus side, MTA is continuing to make sure that due diligence is done appropriately with the new contractor. The question would be, why wasn't the due diligence done, years ago when the original contract was signed? but we are going to make sure that that project gets finished. And then I guess the other question was the Penn and Camden line connector. We are hoping to see sort of a full report. The legislation I mentioned, and if you're interested in looking it up, it's House Bill 1236 from the 2020 legislative session. That we're going to be MTA is required to give us a report, I believe by December. Sort of update a full plan for the Penn and Camden line connectors, but it might require them to move some rail storage yards to be able to connect those two rail lines in Baltimore. But again, there's a situation where you already have two existing rail lines, and it shouldn't really be, you shouldn't be as separate as you are, because to connect currently, I think it's, Jonathan, you probably know better than I do, but it's at least several bus routes, and you're going through the most congested area in Baltimore City, when you should really be able to do it by rail.
Thanks, everybody. I want to quickly thank everybody for getting their questions in. Unfortunately, there's simply no way we're going to get them all tonight. I have one more that I'm going to kind of take. It's actually two sort of on the same topic that I'm going to cover. And then after that, we will be providing in a follow-up email addresses for all three of our panelists. So don't hesitate to follow up with them if you have a question specific to them that you're hoping that they can answer or help you with. So for our final question this evening is in regards to gentrification, both on the Maglev front and the potential for gentrification caused by and brought on by Maglev, and also for the potential for gentrification, Jonathan, if at a West Baltimore MARC stop. I think there are potential concerns there. So could you take that question on and kind of maybe talk a little bit about who benefits at the end of the day from expanded MARC West in Baltimore and who might suffer? And then for the larger group, talk maybe about how we can work to limit the effects of gentrification using transit systems.
For sure, actually, that was one of the things I talked about initially, because it's so important. It's such a critical part of the puzzle. If you stimulate economic development, there's a risk that you're going to stimulate gentrification, and you could end up, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, with a situation like you have in DC, where you have less than 10% of existing residents in those neighborhoods now, west of the river at least. So it was something we have been caught, like we saw in the data almost right away, and you can't avoid it really, because the median house price in Washington, D.C. right now, well, as of October 2020, just crossed the $1 million threshold. That's for single family homes, 1,500, 1,800 square feet, of the kind that are all over Washington and are all over these neighborhoods just behind me. You walk off the platform here and you're right into those neighborhoods. And those houses here go for a lot less, $30,000, $70,000, $150,000, depending upon the conditions. So there's a real potential for gentrification. And so that has really been like one of our major focuses. We have been pounding the table with local and state elected leaders that we need to have a true gentrification mitigation plan for this area. So we got to the point where we said, all right, well, let's write a plan. Let's look at it. We're a research group. Let's dive into the research and let's see what we got. Well, like in the 3 neighborhood clusters just around the West Baltimore MARC station, we have 6,000 vacant houses. Now, that's a liability in some respects, and it's terrible for economic development in those neighborhoods, but it's also a huge asset for land banking for the city to create affordable housing. And I want to thank the legislature. There was a bill that was passed. In this spring. I believe it was HB 1239. That gives you a bit of financial assistance. It actually gives you a lot of financial assistance to close the appraisal gap between what it costs to renovate a vacant house and to sell it as affordable housing. And it has to be sold as affordable housing to realize that subsidy for developers. So that's tremendously important. I will give a shout out to a key bill that was co-introduced by Senator Cardin in 2020, which is the exact same bill. It's almost verbatim in terms of wording, and that would increase the subsidy. But again, those houses have to be sold as affordable housing. So you have a tremendous asset there to create affordable housing. And to limit gentrification. But even beyond that, when you get into the nuts and bolts of it, and you look at things like homeowners in the area, you have 30% of the houses, 30% of the houses in the three neighborhood clusters around the West Baltimore MARC station that are owner occupied. If you just put in the legislation, a cap on how much those property taxes can rise every year, you can, like some small number that rises on a low basis, like a 2021 basis for the next 25 years, you have, just with the simple stroke of a pen, guaranteed that at least 30% of the existing residents in these areas can't be forced out by gentrification, no matter how much revitalization happens. So the point is that there's tools out there we can use, and we have a really unique opportunity in West Baltimore to build a model for development that takes in gentrification ahead of time. And we are working, the elected leaders, really hard to get those plans in place. And I'm happy to tell folks more about that offline if they want to contact me. But we recognize that, and we got a super plan for West Baltimore, and I think it's doable.
I wish I could work in just one neighborhood and have that degree of focus and expertise that Jonathan has. That's really impressive. I mean, it is very true that for any of these transit projects, we have to have preservation and anti-displacement policies and strategies up front. They are great tools for economic revitalization and so forth, but to have an inclusive community, let's figure out ahead of time using tools like those Jonathan's talked about. He mentioned briefly land trust, community land trust can be a tool. Get that land in a trust, or either public trust or a nonprofit trust, such that you can maintain its affordability for the long term. Have inclusionary zoning where the market will allow for it, where new development includes more affordable units. Use your housing trust funds and expand those and spend it on building new affordable housing, if not rehabbing others and converting market rate affordable today to long-term committed affordable. Again, think about how much money they're asking for in this Maglev versus how little we spend in public funds for affordable housing, either state or local level in our region. It's shameful. And that's the sort of difference in priorities. Spend it on affordable housing, spend it on the transit people need. And we're convinced you can have both. You can have an inclusive community and better transit for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think both Jonathan and Stuart covered a lot of it, but I think what I would say is, that's a problem in many areas for, a decade or more down the road. And I think, Jonathan and Stuart are exactly right. We need to be forward thinking about it. But for so many parts of the region, there really is no affordable housing that isn't going to absolutely destroy your commute. I will not try to pull the numbers off the top of my head. I was trying to find my sheet of notes, but when you look at in the vision document that we put out with the Greater Washington Partnership, the amount of additional space that is unlocked, the amount of housing that is unlocked for commute under an hour for people to get to good paying jobs is mind blowing. And when you think about I'll use again Montgomery County and Frederick as sort of a context. The reason that we have such a housing shortage, frankly, closer into the DC core, is because people do not want to sit in their car in soul-crushing traffic, as our governor loves to say, on 270. But what he has not done is then put the investments into the Brunswick line or into alternatives that would be appropriate. But to have a Brunswick line where you could get on, and you could be in Virginia, with ultimately run-through service in 45 minutes from points, that might take you an hour and a half or 2 hours to drive. Or if you're in Harford County and you want to be able to work regularly in Baltimore or in DC without having to get in your car, that's what this could unlock. And that allows affordable housing, that allows communities that, that are affordable right now that previously nobody would really think about living in, to be able to access housing stock that frankly, nobody thinks about, because it's just, when you think about where the jobs are and what your commute would be, it's just not feasible. So again, I think as Stuart and Jonathan said, we need to be thinking about this as we're making these investments, but I think we've got housing stock in the state. It's not accessible to people where jobs are right now.
So just to follow up on that, Kyle, if I can just follow up for 2 seconds. So there's another side, there's the other side of gentrification as well. So Delegate Solomon, you rightly raised the point that we're talking about a decade down the road, maybe 5-10 years at the earliest, probably longer. So what's happening before then? Well, you have the other side of it. We could run Mark Express now. And Harvard just came out with a study a few years ago where they talked about, and I'm reading from it right now, that commuting time has emerged as the single strongest factor in the odds of escaping poverty, more so than other factors like crime, test scores, or the percentage of two-parent families in a community. It's basically the most important thing, or one of the most important things you can do to lift folks up out of poverty. And right now, we could run Mark Express trains from this station, and there are 16,000 existing residents right now in the 3 neighborhood clusters around the station who could all then very easily access the downtown Washington, D.C. job market. It would be transformational for their lives, particularly when it's paired with a preservation of affordable housing plan. So there's another side to it. Besides gentrification, there's the helping folks, the existing residents, access those jobs.
I think that is going to wrap us up this evening. So before we close out, I want to just kind of issue everybody a big call to action, which is stay involved, keep coming to these events, contact these groups that are here. We will send around contact information, contact your elected officials, both about transit priorities and the Maglev. Please stay involved. I'm going to quickly drop another poll onto the chat, which will allow us, if you would like to sign up for different folks' email addresses or email lists, the Coalition for Smarter Growth and our other partners. If you'd like to hear from them more often, if you'd like to hear from Delegate Solomon more often, please click yes and let them know, and they can get you plugged into the work that they're doing. So please take a moment to fill out this poll, and thank you all for coming this evening, and we'll talk soon. And of course, as people fill out this poll, just a quick thank you to those who joined us this evening. A big thank you to Delegate Solomon. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Jonathan and Stuart. And thank you, of course, to our numerous champions on this on this campaign against the Maglev and our campaign to boost transit. So on that note, I'm going to leave the poll up, but I think we're going to go ahead and stop the recording this evening. So thank you so much for coming. Please fill out this poll on your way out the door. And thank you all, and good night. So take care, everybody.